President Donald Trump is set to impose new 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminium imports. Speaking aboard Air Force One, Trump said he will also introduce reciprocal tariffs on countries that tax US goods. He says the move is simple. If they charge us, we charge them. Canada, Mexico, Brazil and South Korea are among the top steel suppliers to the United States, while Canada is also the biggest aluminium exporter. Trump's announcement has already hit global markets, with South Korean steel stocks falling. Canadian officials are slamming the decision, calling it disruptive and harmful to trade. Meanwhile, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says he will push for an exemption, just as Australia received in Trump's first term. This marks another escalation in Trump's trade policies, with potential retaliation expected from key trading partners, including China. The full list of affected countries does still remain unclear. Ross, coming back to you on this one, of course, when the 25% tariffs for Canada and Mexico were first introduced, they were then rescinded after deals were made. But is this a bit of a kick or a punch in the guts for those countries, because these tariffs are still, by all intents and purposes, going to be impacting those nations despite the deal that's been made?
It's going to be a very significant tariff, and it will have an impact on steel and aluminum exporters to the United States. But we have to be frank, most countries do seek to protect their steel and aluminum industries. They look at it as a vital part of their manufacturing sector. And the United States has long been concerned that its competitors, specifically within the steel and aluminum industry, that competitors receive unfair advantages from their home country governments, such as subsidies or discounted electricity or other types of benefits that the United States government hasn't made available to U.S. steelmakers. So that leaves the only option to protect the domestic industry is to impose tariffs on the foreign products. When it comes to the reciprocal tariffs, President Trump, to his credit, he's able to distill the issue down to its simplicity, which is if they are imposing tariffs on us for similar products, we'll impose tariffs on them for their products to enter the United States. And it's something that the public can understand, and Trump's able to explain it clearly and simply. And he's going to do it. I think he's made it clear that in the coming hours, he's going to make some announcements on reciprocal tariffs. And yes, other countries, whether they are allies of the United States or just exporters to the United States, they're going to be upset, they're going to complain, and their domestic industries might be hurt by this, but President Trump is just simply trying to level the playing field.
Ross, I'd like to stay with you and pick up on your point of just domestic interest and domestic business. We know that the initial 25% tariffs on goods coming from Canada and Mexico were going to have a potential impact on the economy within the United States. Do you think these tariffs that have been introduced on steel and aluminium will have a similar impact, or will it be slightly less given that they're not everyday objects that all companies are using?
It's a difficult issue, and we can only make predictions. It's hard to say for sure what'll happen. One outcome might be that domestic suppliers in the United States, they raise their prices because they're going to have less foreign competition, and that wouldn't be very good for the consumers of steel and aluminum, whether that's the automobile sector or regardless of what sector it is, ultimately the end user, the consumer, people like us. But another possible outcome of this will be that prices might come down and be cheaper if domestic suppliers will supply to domestic buyers at reasonable prices without the fear of lower cost foreign products coming in. There could be a benefit. So it really is up to how the domestic industry is going to play this.
Roger, I'd now like to look at the other nations that have been impacted and nations that might look to retaliate. Of course, we've got Canada, Mexico, but also Brazil, South Korea, and China might also be affected by these new tariffs. And China are a nation who have spoken out and said that they will retaliate. What format could that retaliation look like, and how might that impact not just trade within the US and between China, but geopolitically and internationally?
Look, it can have a significant impact if you look at that. One, you have to understand that major components are shipped from China to the US, and putting on tariffs onto Chinese items is going to increase the prices in the US of many products which the Americans are dependent on directly on the manufacturing on China. So it's not going to be an easy path to work for Donald Trump. If you remember that after coming to power, he spoke to President Xi Jinping and he said that he's working out a way to work together. But at the same time, he has made it very clear that China is, adversary number one for the U.S. and the U.S. is looking at ways to curtail the influence of China when it comes to trade and comes to geopolitical, heft. But it's going to be very difficult to say immediate effect what is going to have. But look, if the tariffs are going to be increased and this game is played, then obviously it's going to cost, it's going to hurt US in many places. It might be a boon as well for many industrialists in US, but that's a long-term game that we have to see. Trump did signal that during his campaign when he said that, and I'll cite the example of Canada here, when he said that Canadians, we get a lot of cars coming in from Canada, and we can always, tariff them, and I would rather make them in Detroit. So that was a very subtle signaling saying that he really wants to get his industry back up and running and not to be too dependent on, allies or different countries for the imports and the requirements of what US has. So he's looking to, kind of reinvigorate the American industrial complex once again. But with China, definitely it's going to be a hot take, and it is going to impact the global markets, and it is going to impact the US market for sure.
Raja, I'd like to look also at another group of nations that might be affected by this. Within Western Europe, of course, the European Union is set to be impacted as well. And this relationship between Trump and the EU is something that we've seen, not necessarily, it's a tense relationship, but there are, of course, differences between Trump's administration versus the Biden administration. We've also seen communication over the Russia-Ukraine war. So do you think there's a risk here that key allies between the EU and the US could be impacted with a tariff like this, which is directly impacting some of those nations within the conglomerate of the EU?
So definitely it will, because if you look at the policy Donald Trump has vis-a-vis Europe, it's very, very different from what the Biden administration had. Donald Trump is more on a fair share policy or, equal spending policy kind of thing, where you have an ally and, you're putting the equal bill together. But with Biden, it was more softer. The Americans were ready to, back the Europeans. And look, with the Ukraine-Russia war, it's Europe which has taken the maximum impact of that war in terms of inflation and prices. But with Donald Trump being a bit hostile and, demanding more, I would say, rather not being hostile, but he's demanding more from his ally partners in Europe to deliver and to come on, on a fair share play. So I think, yes, at the end of the day, it's going to hurt Europe as well, and European countries will be looking at this very closely, how this develops.
Ross Feingold, I'd like to come to you as we finish up this discussion. Looking at Trump's statement that reciprocal tariffs will impact everyone, this is more of a sign, isn't it, that Donald Trump is going about his goals and potentially not thinking about the consequences for other nations. Do you agree with that statement?
Not necessarily. I think a lot of economists have pointed out that a trade war or a tariff war could raise prices for U.S. consumers. And I think we have to be fair to President Trump. I'm sure he's cognizant of that, but he has said recently, though, that there might be some short-term pain for U.S. consumers, but the United States will win in the long term. And that's ultimately what this is about. It's about protecting United States industry and about ensuring U.S. companies have fair access to overseas markets, just the way foreign companies have easy access to the United States market. And I'll just say again what I said earlier, which is elections have consequences. And when the voters in the United States voted for President Trump, they knew that this is what they were going to get.